course of the night. We need to make some investment. The good news is that we have formed an energy committee. Mike is the liaison to that committee. I believe at the last meeting they're focusing on making energy improvements at Town Hall. Whether or not, how much of an investment has to be made, we'll find out. Interesting thing in my meetings with the selectmen, we've been meeting in Andover, and the Andover selectmen brought in their department head for buildings and grounds, and in Andover all the buildings, including the schools, for maintenance are under one head. What this gentleman had explained and had shown, thousands and thousands of dollars of savings with 2 and 3 year paybacks. But what I learned from it, a lot of it came from the electric company's incentives and paybacks, and they actually fund a lot of this. Well, we belong to Reading Municipal Light. They're not part of that overall program, so we have another handicap. Not that Reading Light is bad, it's just that they don't participate in having those funds that the major public utilities have. So there's work being done, and more needs to be done, but it's not being ignored. Sean.
Well, we're working hard, yes. Can we work harder, yes? But that's not what you want to hear. That's what we got elected to do. I know that's when I got elected. I knew the job wasn't going to be easy. Other things that we can be more proactive on, I agree, Deanna. I think this board and this town can be more proactive in terms of how we can generate revenue. I certainly believe that town property should be looked at in terms of how it can be sold or leased to generate revenue for this community. In addition to that, naming rights. Have we looked at naming rights for Ipswich River Park? Have we looked at naming rights for any of the school athletic fields? Can we generate revenue? Maybe it's not the best time, but I think it should be looked at. Let's see what we can generate going forward. And those are things I think we've been lacking in terms of our effort in that regard. So for that, I apologize. In terms of the work and the effort has been on collective bargaining, and I think the employees of the town need to realize that it's a partnership here. Times are very difficult, and you have to come to the table and reasonably and fairly negotiate contracts going forward. Going forward, every contract is up for renegotiation. And in terms of collective bargaining, although we can't get into the details, since I came on board here, and most recently we've implemented some change in terms of how contract negotiations will be conducted going forward. And I think that would be productive in terms of the end result overall, for the greater good. For far too long, the residents of the community have borne the cost of increased real estate taxes. Our school children have borne the cost and the sacrifice in terms of decreased programs, cuts in teachers, increased user fees. Athletically, the rec had to increase their user fees. The impact has been tremendous upon the families of this community. It has to change, and I believe it will going forward. So we have more work to do. We will do it. I think in terms of revenue generation, that's what this board needs to really put their energies towards and come to some solution. Because too often we're looking at where are we making the cuts in terms of where can we generate the revenue. I think wastewater is another thing that has to get back on the table on the planning board, and the forum's got to be put together. The community needs to be educated, because ultimately, as I stated when I ran for this office, that's our way up. Wastewater is our way up. We have to find a solution, whether it's a modified plan or something that gets us going in terms of wastewater, that will generate the increased commercial base that we desperately need and take the burden off the residents in this community, both the families and the elderly in this community. So I've heard you, I've listened, and I know where our work has to continue and improve.
Anyone else have any? Yes.
Debbie Hill, 33 Strawberry Lane. I have a question and a comment based on what Rita had asked to the school department. I understand and appreciate everything that you're doing to try to save money, but with regard to the paraprofessionals replacing substitute teachers, can you explain to us here in the group and for those at home that are listening paraprofessionals are, what their job is, and what they're being taken away from in order to substitute for those classrooms that are missing their teacher?
We have almost 60 paraprofessionals, and it probably will be paraprofessionals that are involved in recess and lunchroom supervision and special education, libraries, computer lab.
So what happens to those children? For example, if that paraprofessional is assigned to a child in need of special education, so what happens to those children during the course of the day? What happens to the classroom now that they're going to be set back into?
A lot of change. Service won't be provided.
And does that go against mandates that the state requires?
In some cases, it will.
And again, you have to realize if we have to reduce our budget by $200,000, we're reducing it in the next 6 months. It's not even like we have a whole fiscal year to do it. So as much as we may want to economize on energy and paper and things like that, there's going to have to be some place where there's going to be more substantial savings. And that's not an ideal situation by any stretch of imagination, but what it amounts to is a reduction in services, no question.
I saw our handout in the back there.
Yeah, I also for Roland Park. Just a quick question, actually. You mentioned actually one of the bullet points up earlier was to report waste that we find. So who should we be reporting waste?
Reported to Town Hall, Town Administrator's Office. Call one of a member of the Board of Selectmen. Our phone numbers or email addresses are posted on the town website.
Thank you.
Rita, are you stuck? Mrs. Holmes?
Yeah, just 2 quick points. It's not a good answer to say that they're not going to be educated. If a professional steps in or a substitute teacher steps in that may not be the best teacher in the school, but a good teacher, and teaches the children math, history, science, whatever you teach them, pretty much the same way as a good teacher, that's a good answer. If the answer is going to teach the way we did when we were kids, that a substitute teacher just babysat us and read just read a book while they were taking the class, that's not a good answer. So if the answer is they're still going to be educated, equal to what the kid in the classroom next to him or on the other side of him is, that's a good answer.
I think there's probably single-day absences, that there's going to be some maneuvering and manipulating down on single-day absences, no question about it.
2, 3, 4 weeks, months,
Yeah.
it's got to be a different answer.
No, I'm not talking about that. I think the question was what's happening on the 1 or 2 days. That's what I'm talking about, not the long term. I think I answered the question before. In the long term, I'm putting a substitute in there rather than hiring a contracted teacher. And I gave the example in physical education at the Hood School. The teacher left at the end of September. I did not hire another teacher. I appointed a long-term substitute that I'm getting at a substantially lower rate. The person is still qualified and still certified in doing the job. That's not what the question was. The question was in terms of what will not be done by a paraprofessional on a 1-day or a 2-day, and I answered it saying that probably some of those services will not be provided by the paraprofessional in their other job. We're going to have to figure that out. Instead of having 3 people handling lunchroom or keeping a library open for that day, it may not. That's change.
For 1 or 2 days, okay. Thank you.
Correct.
Thank you.
So that's the answer.
Is that, nobody?
Kelly, can I second one for the selectmen? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, you had a second
I
question?
said one more.
All right, let Rita finish your question and then the other floor.
On the selectmen being on both sides of the table, and I'm a parent and also a volunteer in town and go to quite a few selectmen meetings. I think we're extremely fortunate this time to have an extremely good town administrator that is pretty much on top of it. But I also know that over the past 10 or 15 years of selectmen, it's a tendency that selectmen tend to micromanage. And it's because I think their answer is always, well, that's my job and that's my responsibility. I do think sometimes before things even get on the selectmen's agenda, and that might go back to something that Deanna had said, when we're talking about the flagging and the dog park and all different things that come up that wind up making the selectmen's agenda. I don't think they have to. I really think that you can rely more on the town administrator. And I think if you give him something to do, if he had more time to do it. No, I think you do, but I know the poor man is, hit with 5 or 6 calls from whether it's selectmen or parents, when I call every selectman about a certain particular item, but I think the selectmen need to call department heads that are, again, very, very good in town and ask them to take care of it and not assume they can't go to the department head to take care of things. I think a lot of times, even in recreation, we get things back from the town administrator that you look at and go, gee, that person can call us direct. He doesn't need to get involved. I would rather see him spend his time with his department heads being proactive on some things instead of being reactive. I think that happens.
Christy Ferroni, 2 Hillview. In terms of the paraprofessionals not being able to do some of those tasks, can we as parents say, I for one would say, I'll step in and try to help out where I'm qualified to do so? Can you make use of services like that? Because I for one don't want to see a lunchroom with 1 paraprofessional watching over it, or recess with 1 paraprofessional.
No, we're not going to allow that, obviously that low level of supervision, but we are talking about how we can work with parents just to help us out, depending on how things go. No question.
Okay, I think we're winding down here. Marcy?
Just a brief question for the town administrator. You said there would be a hiring freeze and, if necessary, a budget freeze. As the fiscal year continues, any impact of a budget freeze grows kind of exponentially because you have fewer months to make it up. At what point will you make the decision that you need to move in general government from a hiring freeze to a budget freeze?
I think we need to see what the new growth number is going to be. We're waiting for the Department of Revenue to approve the new growth number for the town. And I think that's frankly the next step that we need to wait for, is to see what that number is.
So are you saying that if it doesn't come in as expected, general government will absorb more? Are you going to go back to the school department and general government and redistribute a number?
I think if you're asking whether we're going to make a budget freeze in view of the fact that the town has an opportunity to receive substantial new growth, I would be reluctant to make that as an option.
No, I'm not asking.
No, I would be reluctant to make that as an
No,
option.
I'm not asking. No.
So what is your question?
I guess my question is what I heard was that there was a $300,000, it's not a real deficit, but there was $300,000 in savings to be realized. I heard that the school department was going to ask to realize $200,000 of that, and general government was going to be asked to realize $100,000 of that.
Right.
And when asked how you're going to approach that, you said first a hiring freeze, and if necessary, a budgetary freeze.
Correct.
I'm asking at what point, and a hiring freeze relies on, I assume, vacant positions that are not going to be filled between now and the end of the year.
Right.
So assuming that that's $100,000 that you need to make up, at what point, someone could leave town government tomorrow, or someone could leave town government on June 1st, or no employees could leave town government between now and the fiscal year. At what point do you say, we're not going to be able to make that $100,000, make up that $100,000 on a hiring freeze, and say now we need a budgetary freeze on expenses, and then departments, if it's June 1st, they have to make that all up in 1 month versus 3 months on April 1st. So I guess that's what, is that clear?
It is, but I'm not going to commit a specific timeframe to Marcy, because frankly, I need to have a discussion with my department heads about how we implement that, and when we implement that. I think us making a budget freeze in view of the fact that we have a substantial opportunity to receive new growth might be putting the cart before the horse.
Steve, personally, as a member of the board, I think we should move forward as if there were a $300,000 deficit that we were anticipating before this new growth figure even materialized. I think we should anticipate that we should move forward, this day, or 2 weeks ago, anticipating that we have a $300,000 deficit that we're experiencing.
That's what you would do.
Well, that's what I thought we were going to do. So, again, from my standpoint, I think we need to participate. That's what we're going to be doing, and that if it requires an across the